Welcome to the Professional Diploma in Web Development. If you've always had a keen interest in full-stack web development, then you've come to the right place. This course has been designed for both beginners as well as experienced web developers who seek a practical approach to web development. In this course, we learn all the fundamentals of web development and learn to code from scratch. We'll begin by installing and exploring our scripting environment, after which we'll move on to programming languages of the web. Now, this includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even PHP. We'll cover both front-end and back-end technology stacks. Throughout the course, we'll develop a bunch of interactive web applications that you can add to your profile to strengthen your credibility as a full-stack web developer. From responsive e-commerce applications, style booking systems, and even HR systems, rest assured that this will be a hands-on course. As a bonus, you will also learn all about SQL databases and how to integrate them into your website. In today's lesson, we will explore the use of JavaScript as a programming language and its role in web development. We will also have a look at the JavaScript syntax and identify online code editors that we can use to test our code robustly. Lastly, we'll demonstrate the use of JavaScript in action with a couple of examples. Now, we will be kicking off Module 2, Lesson 1 in Web Development with an introduction to JavaScript. And I think this is a lesson that many have been looking forward to because this is going to be our first official programming language. Now, without further ado, let's have a look at what's coming up in this lesson. Now, the objectives for today's lesson is as follows. First, we'll be exploring JavaScript by unpacking JavaScript as a programming language. We'll have an overview of JavaScript, and we'll also have a look at some of the pros and cons when it comes to using JavaScript as a programming language for web development. Moving forward, we'll then actually look at the syntax when it comes to JavaScript. And essentially, we'll just have a look at some of the keywords and things such as variables and how we can get output in JavaScript. And this brings us to our last point, where we'll do a practical demonstration in one of our selected IDEs, and we'll actually write some JavaScript code. Now, this is going to be a speed code session, but keep in mind, as we progress through this module, I am going to take you from the very basics to the more complex things. The idea is essentially to show you how JavaScript works and what we can do with JavaScript. Now, before we get started with the content, just a quick did you know fun fact about JavaScript. So JavaScript is the world's most widely used programming language according to a study by Stack Overflow. And for those of you who don't know what Stack Overflow is, we will be using this platform quite a bit. And Stack Overflow is essentially a forum or a platform specifically for developers of all kinds. And this includes mobile application developers, web developers, any sort of software development. This is the platform where developers come together and they do research and they assist each other. And Stack Overflow also does its own research in the domain. Now, what is the point behind this fun fact? Well, JavaScript has essentially taken the world by storm when it comes to using it as an object-oriented programming language for the web. Okay, there are other languages such as Python, Node.js, and all of these other new languages that have come about, but essentially JavaScript has been around for the longest, so it's much easier to find support for languages like JavaScript in the event that you get stuck. I think it's time that we can actually dive right into our very first topic, and that is exploring JavaScript. And in this section, we're just essentially going to have an overview of JavaScript, understand what JavaScript is, and also have a look at some of the pros and cons when it comes to JavaScript. So the first question that might come to mind is, what is JavaScript then? Well, JavaScript is essentially a language that focuses on the behavior of a web page or a website. Okay, now while CSS deals with the presentation and HTML deals with the structure and the content of a website, JavaScript focuses on the behavior. And I don't think that's any better said than with this visual illustration that we have. So when it comes to JavaScript is responsible for outputting data, capturing data, processing data, and all of this happens on the front end. Now, the nice thing about JavaScript is that we can actually manipulate our CSS code and our HTML code and even the output as well as the input. We can manipulate all of that using JavaScript. So JavaScript is this extra layer that provides interactivity and functionality to our websites. Excellent. Now, there's also this term called front-end development or front-end architecture. Okay, and what's key here is that we've been working on front-end architecture for a while now. If we have a look at this diagram over here, our front end is essentially everything that happens on the client side. Okay, and we always refer to clients such as browsers. Now, this includes things like Firefox, Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge. All of these are clients on our devices, whether it's a laptop, a mobile device, it really doesn't matter. Now, apart from front end, we can also call it client-side scripting, which is something we discussed very, very early on. Okay. And when it comes to our front end, this is where all the processing happens on the device of the user. Okay. Now this is different from the back end, which we'll get to in a second. What I want you to take note of here is that front end architecture is anything in the web development process that occurs visually for the user on the front end. Okay, and that's where JavaScript comes in. Now, we've worked with HTML, and at some point we must include JavaScript to give our website more interactivity and make things more dynamic. And we can also use the MVC for this, which is not something we're going to get into at this moment. And then lastly, we have our back-end architecture. Now, the back-end architecture is everything database related. Okay, these are things that happen on a server, for example. A server that you might be renting from some sort of internet service provider. And essentially what happens is you have the resources then to dial into the database, dial into the server, host your files, and all of these kind of things. But what I really want you to take note of here is that moving forward, we'll be focusing on finishing the front end architecture with this module. Excellent. So what are some of the pros and cons when it comes to JavaScript? Well, let's start off with the pros. First of all, one of the biggest pros is that JavaScript is a client-side processing language, which means everything occurs in the browser or the client, like we mentioned earlier on. Okay, so the limitation you have is the limitation bound by the user's device. And if you think about it these days, mobile devices are much faster than when computers were several decades ago. Okay, so client-side processing is a great thing because it doesn't have to be managed on the back end or the server. Now, JavaScript is also a cross-platform language, which is ideal when you want to target multiple devices like Windows, Apple devices, as well as Android devices. Okay, there is no limitation in terms of the supported OSs when it comes to JavaScript and scripting for the web. And then lastly, JavaScript is extremely easy to learn, and I am a strong believer of this. JavaScript was actually one of my first languages when it came to programming that I've learned. And what makes JavaScript so nice is that it's very lean and robust and very human readable as well. It's also a very primitive language, which makes it exceptionally easy to learn. Now, what are some of the cons when it comes to JavaScript? Well, the first one is that there are security concerns surrounding JavaScript. And the first one here being that JavaScript is not a back-end language, although we can use Node.js as a back-end language, but we tend to use JavaScript strictly for the front-end stuff, and we never or hardly ever use it for any sort of back-end because it was just not built for that. Okay, and then lastly, there is a couple of issues when it comes to browser compatibility. Now, yes, we did say it's cross-platform, but if we look at outdated browsers such as Microsoft Explorer, Internet Explorer, I believe it was, that browser is extremely outdated and no longer available. In fact, it's become obsolete. Okay, so as JavaScript improves, these older engines, these older browsers, they become obsolete and they are no longer supported by the new version of JavaScript. Now, with that being said, you might also be wondering, what exactly can you do with JavaScript? Well, essentially, JavaScript, like we mentioned before, controls the behavior of our browser window or our client. This is often known as the DOM, the Document Object Model, which basically means you get to manipulate anything that the user sees on their device. And this is things like transitions, pop-ups, any sort of interactivity that comes with the website. You generally build this out using JavaScript. Okay, and here are two usages that you could consider when it comes to using JavaScript as your OOP language for web development. First of all, you can use it to display data, which is a very simple example, and you can also use it to provide interactivity for your website. And this is something we've iterated for some time now. But I think it's going to be better if we actually have a look at an example of how we can use JavaScript for these two operations or processes. So just to give you a bit of context in terms of how we can provide interactivity and show data using JavaScript, I've created these two scripts over here that you can check out. Okay, test 1 and test 2. So in the event with test 2, what we're essentially doing is we are creating our HTML code as we normally do. Then we call this thing onClick, and this is our JavaScript code over here, just this section over here. And we are saying onClick, when clicking the button, access the document, get the element by ID known as demo, okay, which is this paragraph tag over here, and then set the inner HTML to this date object over here. So we're getting the current date. So what does that look like? So once I refresh this page and I click this over here, I'm getting an update for the date, okay, which is quite cool, I think. So this is how we can show or display information using JavaScript. Now, the second example that we spoke about earlier is providing interactivity. And here it's slightly more complex because we are creating a function called touchRock, and then we are creating a variable called username. Then we are prompting the user to enter something. If the username exists, which is what we're prompting the user for, then alert something to the screen, which is, it is good to meet you with your username concatenated, right? And then we are adding this little rock sort of image to our code, okay? And then on load, when we load the page, when the window or the DOM loads immediately, this is the first thing you will see. So let's see all of this in action when we refer to the interactivity example. So I'll refresh this over here, and now I'm being prompted with an alert. Hello, I am your pet rock. Great. So now if I click on this pet rock, he's going to ask me for my name, and I'll just say Rushan. And if I click OK, it says, it is good to meet you, Rushan. Okay, and then the rock smiles. Now that's just a very simple example of how we can provide interactivity as well as show data using JavaScript. Now I do think it's time that we revisit the HTML DOM as well as JavaScript. And essentially when it comes to the HTML DOM, it's just this standard object model and programming interface for HTML, which means there are various elements and attributes and all of these things that we can manipulate using JavaScript in the DOM. Okay, so the HTML DOM is a standard for how to get elements, how to change those elements, how to add, delete, or even update certain parts of an element. And we do this by accessing the DOM so that we can trigger some sort of attribute or manipulate some properties. Now, for the most part, we have been working with the DOM since we created our first HTML document, which is signified by, in this hierarchy, the document itself, which is, for example, index.html. Then we have our root element inside of our HTML document, which is the HTML tags that we use to open up and close the document with. Now, as we progress, remember, HTML works semantically, so the code is read from the top to the bottom. And this applies when it comes to our elements as well. So inside of our HTML element, we would also have our header tag as well as the body tag as two separate components of the DOM or the HTML document. Okay, and then as we go further into the hierarchy, we can add things like titles, anchor tags, h1 tags, href tags. All of these things are enclosed by our header tags or things like our body tags. And then lastly, our lowest level of the DOM are things like our text as well as images, for example, or even div containers. Okay, so the DOM is just an hierarchy. It shows you the hierarchy of an HTML document and how we can manipulate these elements and how they behave using JavaScript. Now, to summarize how we can use JavaScript and the DOM, essentially we can use these two to define things like HTML elements as objects. And this is important when it comes to JavaScript because every element and every thing we handle in HTML when it comes to using JavaScript, we treat it as an object. And an object could be something like a car, for example, an actual person, and there are certain elements and properties that you would want to manipulate of these objects. And this brings us to our second point. We can manipulate these properties by altering them using JavaScript. Typical example, you can switch a car on or off. A car has a certain color, a certain wheelbase. It's got all of these elements or all of these attributes and properties that you can manipulate, but you can do so with JavaScript. Now we can also use methods to access the behavior of HTML elements, and as we progress, I will show you exactly how we go about doing this. And we can also call events and handle events with elements. For example, a typical and one of the most common events when it comes to elements is that of a button. When you click on a button, that's an event. When you release a button, that's an event. When you hover over something, that's an event. Now, once these events occur, we can sort of manipulate other objects using these events by calling them in JavaScript. Excellent. Now let's move on to our next topic in this lesson, which is the syntax in JavaScript. And the idea here is essentially just to briefly introduce you to the syntax and how the syntax works and how we write our JavaScript code. Now, first of all, when it comes to the syntax in JavaScript, we will first have a look at the overview. And essentially, every instruction or line of code in JavaScript is known as a statement. So This alert example that we have over here is just a statement, okay? And statements can be executed from the top to the bottom in your code. Now, when you're writing your JavaScript, much like HTML, the browser interprets the code from the top through to the middle, down to the bottom, which means it is built in a semantic fashion, okay? And each statement must end with a semicolon. If not, your code will crash or your code simply won't work. And again, what we have here is a simple alert statement. And if we had to run this statement in our IDE, this would just throw a pop-up out into our browser window saying something like statement, okay? So this one line of code that we have here, again, we refer to this as a statement. Now, one thing that we must be cognizant of is that JavaScript is a case-sensitive language. So in this example where we have this alert function and we've entered the attribute, or we've entered the parameter statement, the string here, statement, this is the way that we do it when we use the alert function. This would be the incorrect way of writing the same function. The function will not run because, again, JavaScript is case sensitive. So in the case of the alert function, you have to spell alert in lowercase for this to actually work, okay? Using the second example, the code simply will not run. Excellent. Now, one last point when it comes to the overview of the syntax in JavaScript, we always follow camel case naming conventions. Well, not always, but this is best practice for JavaScript developers or just web developers overall. And camel case is essentially what we have here in this one line of code where we say var my variable. Now, essentially what's happening here is you don't have to know all the background details because we will be working with variables in future. But essentially what we are doing here is we are creating a variable called my variable. And we do this by stating the word var, and then followed by this, we start with our camel case where the first word would be my, but the first letter of that word would be in lowercase, and then the second word variable, the first letter in this word would be in uppercase, okay? So this is why we call it camel case, because it starts with small and then it sort of grows big, okay? And this is just, again, one of the best naming conventions when it comes to creating things like variables or functions in JavaScript. Now, earlier on, I did mention that we have reserved keywords in JavaScript, and here are some of those words. We have abstract, we have boolean, we have break, we have byte, case, catch, char, class, constant, continue, final, int. There is really so many words here that are reserved specifically for the implementation of the language itself, which means you can't call a variable import or void or var or abstract, for example. When you use any of these keywords, your IDE will generally highlight these keywords as built-in functions or reserved words of JavaScript. Okay, we also have characters like the ampersand sign or the greater than or equal to or the less than sign, and even the percentage sign. All of these keywords and characters are reserved for specific functions in JavaScript, and therefore we can never use them as standalone keywords for naming variables, for example. Now, much like all programming languages and every single one that we've covered so far, there is also the possibility of commenting in JavaScript. And this is important for the very same reason that other languages do the same thing or use commenting. It's essentially so that you can let developers know what your code is doing. Okay, and we can comment in one of two different ways in JavaScript. The first one being 2 forward slashes represents a single line of comment. So the comment never gets rendered out to the browser. Okay, and here we have a typical example of how this single line comment works, where our example here says prevent default from behavior, do not want form to refresh. Now that's very vague, but again, when it comes to commenting, your words don't actually have to be on point or precise. Okay, they just need to summarize what you are trying to achieve with your code. Okay, so anything written after your 2 forward slashes would be rendered out as a comment and would not be displayed in the client. The second way we can do this is by using the / asterisk and then the asterisk / again. And in between this content, this is where you can add multiple lines of comments. Okay, so instead of having just one line, you could have multiple lines. And here we have a typical example of that, where anything written between these two asterisks, regardless of being on 2 separate lines, they are treated as a block. Okay, so the comment is a block and not a single line comment. And this is essentially the 2 different ways that we can comment in JavaScript code. Now, just as a bonus, I also decided to include a list of online JavaScript editors that you could use in the event that coding and mobility is your thing, or if you don't have access to a desktop or laptop machine. Okay, the first one is JS Fiddle, and JS Fiddle is by far my favorite because it's quite lean, it's very lightweight, and it allows us to write code on the cloud and then run that code on the cloud without having to do any sort of computing on our local devices. Now, we tend to use online editors because it's robust and quick, and it's a great way to sort of play around with our code and test our code. The next one is CodePen. CodePen is also quite popular and actually updates your UI or your output in real time. Okay, and then lastly we have JSBin, which is also quite capable, although the UI might be slightly primitive compared to the previous two. Although JSBin is quite lean or quite easy to become familiar with. Now, for the most part, if we are working in any of these online editors, we will be opting for JS Fiddle because, like I said, it's my favorite, and I will introduce you to this particular platform. Now, before we wrap things up with our final topic today, let's have a look at what's coming up in our next lesson, lesson 2. In our next lesson, we dive right into scripting with JavaScript code. First, we will familiarize ourselves with creating JavaScript variables, and we'll also have a look at the different data types that JavaScript has to offer. We will then move on to outputting our actual code to the client. So stay tuned because our next lesson is going to be a practical one. Wonderful. Now, for an actual demonstration in JavaScript, I essentially want to just introduce you to how we can use JavaScript in web development. Now, I'm not going to be going through every single line of code. The idea is just to show you what we have in store when we pair JavaScript with web development. Now, before we get started with this brief demo, let's have a look at what we'll actually be working towards. And essentially, it's just this very, very basic page that says JavaScript's interaction with HTML is handled through events. And that's what this demo is about. And keep in mind, this is going to be a speed coding session. Okay. Now, what happens is that with this UI, with this web page, you are able to generate your timetable if you are a student. Okay. So if I type in the day Tuesday, and I click on generate timetable, it's going to give me my classes for that specific day. Not so much the times because that's not included in this demo, but then I'll see I have information systems 353 and maybe I've got management 305 on a Tuesday. Okay, if I refresh, it basically puts the page back to its default state. And if I go ahead and type in, let's say Thursday, I'm going to get a different output. Okay, so I'll have 3 classes on that day, including stats. Okay, and then if I go ahead and select Friday, which is where I've included an Easter egg view, I get this thing that says no class, yay, with a smiley face, and then just a quick meme at the bottom that says, hey there Friday, you sexy beast, I've been looking for you since Monday. Wonderful. So let's get started on building out this demo. So to start building out our quick demo, the first thing we have to do is open our project folder. And what you'll notice is that in this project folder that I have over here, I've got default files. So I've got my index page or my index.html page. I've got this user icon, which we won't necessarily be using. I've got the meme that I want to include, and I have my style guide over here. So I'm going to open up this in Atom. Okay. So I head back over to Atom. I'll say open folder. Okay, and then on my desktop, let's just locate that quickly for a second. So desktop, I'm going to access my Shore sandbox, and then I'm going to target this folder, lesson 1, okay, because that's where everything is sitting. Now, what I need to do is I need to create a JavaScript file and connect it with my HTML document. In the event here, or in this case over here, we've already connected it using the script tag, okay, and then we reference the source, and we are pointing to this file called main.js, okay. Everything else should be pretty familiar to you, okay, and this includes our header, our content inside, as well as our styling document. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to open up to see what we have so far. Okay, so we have exactly everything that we wanted to work with when I showed you the demo that we're working towards. The only difference here is that we've got no interactivity with this website, okay? So nothing happens when I click this button. Even if I put in a different day of the week, nothing is going to happen. And this is because we don't have any JavaScript code embedded. So we need to go and hook that JavaScript code up, much like we do with our CSS document, so that we can get all of that functionality. Now, what we need to do next is we need to include all of the JavaScript code. But before we can even do that, we need to create a file for our JavaScript, and if we have a look at our index page over here, we've got this thing called main.js, but this file does not exist. So we essentially need to create this file from scratch. So how do we go about doing that? We do it exactly the same way we've created all other files in Atom. And I'm going to save this file immediately. So I'll say save as, and I'll save it as main.js, because that is the file that the HTML file is going to be looking for. Okay, so I'll save that, make sure it's in the same folder, and I can start writing my code. But because I have the code and it already exists, I'm going to cut and paste that code over here and then run through it with you and explain what's happening in terms of the JavaScript code. So the first thing I want to include is the variables. Okay, our variables is not something we've covered yet, but we are going to be covering this in our next lesson. And essentially what we did is we created this variable button, user input, container, body, and then this other variables or this array called Monday through to Friday. Okay, one for each day of the week. And then we have this thing called document.getQuerySelector. Okay, and we reference the my button ID over here. So where do we get this information? Well, this exists inside of our HTML code. Okay, here we have it, my button. So we are essentially referencing elements in our HTML code, like with the DOM model that we explained earlier. And we are putting it into JavaScript so we can work with those elements, okay? And we're doing exactly the same for the user input, which is that field, the container, which is the box itself, and the body of the content, okay? So we are putting all of these things in so we can manipulate it with JavaScript. And then we created these array lists over here, or this list of arrays, for the various subjects for a given day. So Monday has 1, 2, 3, 4 indexes, okay? And arrays is something we'll also cover at some point. Now, if I save this, nothing is still going to happen because I haven't made any sort of functionality changes to my website. I've essentially just created these empty boxes, if you will, called variables, and then I've assigned them values, okay, in the form of the actual HTML elements as well as the days of the week over here. Wonderful. So moving on, what I want to do now is start creating my functionality. And the first one I'm going to bring in, let's actually just copy and paste what I have over here, and I'll paste that here. So I've got this function that changes the hover color of hovering over a certain object, okay, which is my button in this case. So I've created a function. We can see that by the name function over here, and this function is called set hover color. And this curly braces that we see over here, these are the inputs for the parameters. So in this case, I'm saying button, I'm accessing your style, and your attribute that is background or background color, I'm setting that to a different color. Now this is still not going to work, and I'll show you in a second why. Now I'm also creating a function to set it back to its normal color, okay, which is when we give it a blank default value over here in this little string that we have here. And then lastly, what I'm saying is assign event listeners to the button. So I'm taking the events, these events called mouse over, mouse out, and click. They're all being called as a result of the functions that I'm creating. So the functions over here that I created with the set normal color, set hover color, I'm calling those functions on the button. So I'm saying on the button, add an event listener. Now listen for a mouse over event or a hover event. And when that event occurs, do this thing called set hover color. And if I refresh and save this, and I head back over to my code and I refresh, I now get this change in my color, okay? So my JavaScript is working just fine. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually add the main function, which is that function that prints out my timetable. Okay, so I'm going to copy and paste everything I have once again. So I'm going to copy everything from Monday up until Friday, which is what we have for our timetable generator. Okay, so I'll copy, make sure I've got all my code, and voila, paste. Okay, so now let's see what's happening over here. So I'll save this up. Now, after I've created these event listeners, okay, I also have a function over here. But what I want you to take note of is that these two functions are occurring before we even call them, okay, using an event listener. So this function over here is being created after we've already called it on the click. Okay, so when clicking the button, we want to call this function print the actual timetable. Okay, but again, that's being written after we've actually called it. Now, that's the nice thing about JavaScript. You can write your functions anywhere in the body of your JavaScript document, and then you can call that function anywhere throughout the code. What's important though is that you cannot simply just create the function and expect it to work like these three over here. You must create the function and call the function. And generally we do this with an event listener by adding an event listener to an element. In this case, we've added 3 event listeners to our button over here. Okay, for the various states: mouse over, mouse out, and click. Now, for our print timetable function, we've got the first one over here, which is Monday. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm using a conditional, and what we're saying is if, right? This is called a conditional. If the user input value, the value of whatever the user inputs over here, if that value is equal to Monday, we use double equal signs to test for the value of the element that we put in. Okay, if the user input value, that field value is Monday, if the user types in Monday or passes the value Monday, then do this. Okay, what we are essentially doing now is we are creating a loop. So here we start our loop. This is called a for loop. So we're saying for variable I that we're just creating inside of this loop is equal to 0, right? And what we're saying is if I is less than Monday's length, increment I. Okay, now again, this all sounds like a mouthful and might be confusing, but don't be alarmed, because we are going to have an in-depth session on loops. Okay, and we are going through the loop and we're saying grab the paragraph text, which is what I created up. Okay, I didn't create it in this document. Let's just see. Grab the paragraph text. I'm creating this variable in this instant over here. Okay, so I'm saying variable paragraph text document.create element paragraph. So I'm creating a new element and I'm assigning that element to this variable called paragraph text or parent text. I'm doing the same here where I'm creating parent node and I'm assigning the index of Monday, which is I over here, right? And then I'm appending that to parent node and my parent text. Okay, now this part over here is probably the most confusing part out of this entire demo. But again, it's okay. Let me reassure you, these are things we will be covering in depth. Okay, and we're doing exactly the same here. So essentially what we're doing is we are deciding what value the user passes in, okay, for each of these statements, whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, up until to Friday, right? And we are essentially saying grab this list depending on the day and assign that list to the paragraph text and the paragraph node. Okay, and we do exactly the same for Wednesday, for Thursday, and so on. The only difference here is with Friday we're working a little different because we're bringing in an image. So apart from parent text and parent node, we are creating this variable called img for image, and we are appending an image element to it. Okay, so we create the element in the document, we assign it to this variable, and then we call that image, and then we set the source of that image. Okay, and the source, like we know, is normally a path file. In my case, it's this one over here, this Friday meme that we have. Okay, so we assign that to the image element, okay, the source. We call the parent text, we append the child in the container, we also append the parent text and the node, and then we style our parent text slightly different. So we have this increased font size of 24 pixels, and then we append the image to the body. Okay, so that's the only difference. Our Friday code, our code for Friday, and the output is going to be significantly different from all the others, which just shows you your timetable. Okay, so let's save this and see what happens. Now if I refresh and I type in Monday, all should work just fine. And there we go. It's generating my Monday timetable for classes, which is economics 323, information systems 353, management 305, and information systems 362. Okay, so I can refresh this to make sure the other days work as well. So I'll go with Tuesday and working just fine. Now let's refresh one more time and go with Friday. And voila, our code is working just fine. Now, you'll note this is very different from all the other demos that we did in HTML and CSS, because here we are working on interactivity and functions. Okay, when it came to HTML and CSS, we just created static websites with a bit of animation here and there, and we just made the websites look more appealing by using CSS. Wonderful. Now, in our next lesson, we are going to dive into variables as well as data types. And that's where we'll really start to unpack how we work with JavaScript, or at least the very basics. And also, in the event that you do want the code for this session, I will be making it available via the summary notes. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you do want to pull it and you want to play around with the code, you are more than welcome to actually check out the summary notes and copy the code.